interpretive reading, actually it's a recitation, of the wasteland. He has memorized the entire poem, and he will perform it for you, and it's a brilliant performance. But the thing he emphasizes, and I'm excited about the fact that when he introduces this poem, this is actually where he begins as well with the title, he emphasizes the fact that there's all these voices that are subsumed in this poem. This can be very confusing. If you pick up this poem and just start reading it, if you don't know what you're looking for, you can become incredibly frustrated by all the different voices that are a part of this poem. Number two, let's say it this way. T.S. Eliot has read a lot. He is influenced by this reading. None more than the French symbolist poets, especially, I believe, the poet Baudelaire. Baudelaire, he has this collection of poems called Flowers of Evil. And his opening poem is a poem called To the Reader. Now, I want to read this poem to you. We're not going to annotate it or anything at our 3 levels of reading. I just want to read this poem to you. It is a poem, can I say this out loud? This is a poem that usually will never end up in a high school anthology for reasons that will become self-evident once I start reading the poem out loud to you, okay? This is a disturbing poem, and while I read it, I want you to pay attention to 2 things, so write it down. Again, this is called To the Reader. You can go online, by the way, and find this. I'm going to be reading the Stanley Kunitz translation, but you can find this translated in a number of places. 2 things I want you to focus on as I read this poem out loud to you. One is, this is his view of the human condition. And I'm going to tell you out loud, it's pretty depressing. Number 2, he's going to talk about a French word, because he is a French writer, ennui, which usually is translated boredom. But, you know, it actually subsumes a lot more than just boredom. It's that feeling, you're talking to your pal, how's it going? And your pal does this. Students do this often, don't we, right? Right? In other words, it's like boredom, depression, not sure? Well, let's just listen to the way Baudelaire plays the game. To the reader. Ignorance, error, cupidity, and sin possess our souls and exercise our flesh. Habitually, we cultivate remorse as beggars entertain and nurse their lice. Our sins are stubborn. Cowards, when contrite, we overpay confession with our pains. And when we're back again in human mire, vile tears we think will wash away our stains. Thrice potent Satan in our cursed bed lulls us to sleep, our spirit overkissed until the precious metal of our will is vaporized, that cunning alchemist. Who but the devil pulls our waking strings? Admonitions lure us to their side. Each day we take another step to hell, descending through the stench, unhorrified. Like an exhausted rake who mouths and chews the martyrized breast of an old withered whore, we steal in passing whatever joys we can, squeezing the driest orange all the more. Packed in our brains incestuous as worms, our demons celebrate in drunken gangs. And when we breathe, that hollow rasp is death, sliding invisibly down into our lungs. If the dull canvas of our wretched life is unembellished with such pretty ware as knives or poison, pyromania, rape, it's because our soul's too weak to dare. But in this den of jackals, monkeys, curs, scorpions, buzzards, snakes, this paradise of filthy beasts that screech, howl, grovel, grunt, in this menagerie of mankind's vice, there's one supremely hideous and impure, soft-spoken, not the type to cause a scene. He'd willingly make rubble of the earth and swallow up creation in a yawn. I mean ennui, who in his hookah dreams produces hangmen and real tears together. How well you know this fastidious monster, reader, hypocrite reader, you, my double, my brother. In the French, you hypocrite lecteur, mon semblable, mon frère. You, hypocrite reader, my double, my brother. Whoa. Just for a moment, point out, this is the we of the hollow men. We are the hollow men. We are the stuffed men. Let's put it in our notes right away. From Baudelaire, I believe that Eliot learned this speaking directly to the reader, but including himself as a poetic voice in the statement. That is to say, we're all in this together, and what is it that takes all of us down? Ennui, boredom, nothing to do, incredibly bored. The other poem that I'll share with you quickly is the poem, The Albatross. I'm going to read the Kate Flores translation. And this is T.S. Eliot. I think Eliot was very influenced by this poem as well. By the way, just to finish, that "you hypocrite lector m'ensemble mon flemme," that line will be the final line of the first section, first part of the poem, The Wasteland. It will be one. But when Eliot quotes that line, he doesn't quote it in translation. He quotes it in the original French. Well, what happens if you can't read French? Eliot would argue, what's wrong with you if you can't read French? You're not much of an educated person if you can't read French. That's that elitism of Eliot. By the way, that's one of the reasons why he fell out of favor, I think, in the late 20th century, that elitism that he possessed. The albatross is an interesting word picture, and I've used this one before in my lecture on James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. This one is a fascinating little ditty. Look at this one. Albatross, huge birds. You can think, for example, of what we say in our Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner comments, right? We've got that one posted on Learn Strong. You haven't seen that one. Oftentimes for diversion, seafaring men capture albatross, those vast birds of the seas that accompany at languorous pace boats plying their way through bitter straits. Having scarce been taken abroad, these kings of the blue, awkward and shy, piteously their great white wings let droop like oars at their sides. This winged voyager, how clumsy he is and weak. He just now so lovely, how comic and ugly. One with a stubby pipe teases his beak, another mimics, limping, the cripple who could fly. The poet resembles this prince of the clouds who laughs at hunters and haunts the storms. Exiled to the ground amid the jeering pack, his giant wings will not let him walk. Well, I think that this one makes a lot of sense to me to understand as well in terms of what's going on. First of all, I have said already that I think James Joyce here is obviously influenced as well by this poem and by Baudelaire. The stream of consciousness writing, of course, of Joyce is going to influence as well what T.S. Eliot will do. But I think here, for our notes, what we learn from this albatross text is the idea that Eliot will believe that the poet is rejected as the prophet, as the philosopher will be. Remember our comments about how a prophet is rejected in our study of Plato's Republic, right? In the cave allegory. The way that philosopher will go down into the cave and everybody will just make fun of him or whatever. I think T.S. Eliot very much has this in the back of his mind. The idea that the poetic speaker, the voice of the prophet, here in a bit it'll be Tiresias, is marginalized, misunderstood, treated poorly. And for that, I think Eliot, he has serious problems. By the way, if you want to make sure that you know this idea is still with us, go home this evening, walk up to your folks and say, hey, I've decided I know what I'm going to major in college. It's not going to be pre-med. It's not going to be engineering. I've decided I'm going to go to college and major in poetry. And then just watch their face. Because most parents will say, well, poetry is nice, and I like poetry just like everyone else. But what are they going to get around to right away, right? Now, obviously the question is, why if you go and major in engineering, you're going to make a lot of money. If you major in poetry, everybody's going to look at you like, something's wrong with you. I think Eliot was onto something. I think he realized that poetry was about to become marginalized, like, albatross, teased, marginalized, not considered taken seriously or significant. His response was to write Wasteland, maybe. Finally, and I think most importantly, if you're really going to study this poem, you have to know about that classic character from Greek mythology, Tiresias. So let's talk about him for a moment. We will meet Tiresias, and Eliot himself said this was the most important voice of the text. We'll meet him in part 3, the fire sermon. We're going to meet him around line 218, halfway through the poem. All right. But we're going to point out that he's been there the whole time, all the way along. Well, who is he? Well, Eliot said he's the most important personage, uniting all the rest of the voices of the poem. From Ovid's Metamorphosis, we're told this story. There was this guy named Tiresias, as he's walking along the road, and he sees two snakes in the middle of the road that are copulating. Snakes. And he's grossed out by it, so he takes a stick and he whacks the snakes to make them knock it off. Queen goddess Hera is very upset. And for him doing this, she punishes him by turning him into a woman for 7 years. So Tiresias lives first the life of a man, then for 7 years the life of a woman. Wait, the story gets better. After he is transformed back into a man, so that now he knows what it's like to be both a guy as well as a girl, Hera and Zeus have a debate about who enjoys sex more, men or women. Well, Zeus says, let's bring in Tiresias. I mean, he's enjoyed both. He's been a guy, he's been a girl. So let's ask him, Tiresias, who enjoys sex more, guys or girls? Hera assumes that he's going to say guys, and guess what he says? He says, oh, women enjoy sex way more than guys. Hera is so offended by this, she immediately blinds him. For the rest of his life, he's blind. Talk about, the wrong answer, So he's blinded. Wait, we're not done. Zeus, feeling badly for Tiresias because he's been jacked by Hera, Zeus says, I tell you what I'll do. I'll do two things for you. One, I'm going to give you 7 lifetimes. 2, I'm going to give you the power to see the future. That is to say, you can see the future. All right? Even though, note the irony, even though you're blind, you can see. You can't see with your physical sight. You can see, of course, with that other kind of sight. Now, we know that Tiresias ends up in all kinds of mythologies. We heard about him, of course, in the story of the Odyssey when he's visited by Odysseus in the underworld. We hear about him, of course, in the stories of Oedipus, Oedipus the king. So that is the Tiresias. I think that it's significantly important that in our poem, Tiresias is always going to be there, okay? So we're going to hear from Tiresias as we get into this poem. All right. Now, briefly, let's just review our 3 levels of reading and our learning theory. We are working, of course, with 3 levels of reading as we read this text. What does the text say? Level 1, summarizing. What does the text mean? Level 2, we subdivide. 2A, themes, messages. 2B, rhetoric. Not what Eliot says, but how Eliot says it. Put a star on this one in your notes at level 2B. That's where we're going to spend quite a bit of time. You have to. You have to. I mean, if you pick up this poem and you start reading, you come to that first German line. And you're like, dude, what's up with that? Or, for example, these references, these allusions to all these other titles. If you don't know all these other titles, you're going to have to use some kind of help. T.S. Eliot provided notes. Okay, when he published the poem a second time, he provided notes. But some of those notes, scholars have pointed out, are just as obscure as the poem itself. You have lots and lots of help online. So I would definitely challenge you to find that help online, right? That gives you some insight as to exactly what's going on. At level 3, we don't ask, at level 1 we ask, what does the text say? At level 2, what does the text mean? At level 3, how can we relate to the text? At 3A, relate to other titles and to the world. We're going to do a lot of that because Eliot loves his allusions, A-L-L-U-S-I-O-N. Not illusions as in the magician made the elephant, disappear. That's a different illusion. That's I-L-L. A-L-L, references to other titles. T.S. Eliot, as we've already said, at least 30 different texts and more. Many have just spent their time just trying to find all the different allusions. Okay, and then finally at 3B, and most importantly for us because of learning theory, how can I relate personally to a text like this? Why? Because our learning theory, just to remind, is that capacity to connect new information to old information. Now, there's going to be some irony about me saying that, because I'm about to study a poem where nothing connects to nothing. We're going to hear a line like that in this poem, all right? But our challenge is to simply answer it this way. Can I find, I would write this one down as a good question to start this poem. Study with me. Can I find one idea that I can use that has some meaning to me? My job is to kind of help you find those ideas, all right? And of course, it is an obscure and it is a difficult poem, so there has to be some explaining that goes along, no question about it. Speaking of then, let's turn for a brief overview now of the poem. So notice, I'm going to tell you kind of generally what the poem is about. You're going to take a few notes here. We got 5 sections, so you want to write this down and as I go. And once you've kind of got this down, and I definitely recommend that you've got this in your notes, and once you've got this down, you'll use this as kind of a schemata. You'll use this as kind of like the spine to build everything else around in your study of the poem. So let me help you do that, okay? First of all, let's just say this. There's a huge debate after the poem is published about how all this stuff fits together. Okay? The simple one-liner, let me just do it this way for you. You'll maybe remember that I said that the great American philosopher Ken Wilber says in his Marriage of Sense and Soul that modernity is understood as good news, bad news. Right? The idea that there's some good things that happen with modernity, penicillin shots, for example. The cure to polio, for example. That's good news. And then there's some bad news. Like, for example, well, we learned how to split the atom, but then, of course, we learned how to make terrible weapons of mass destruction. Good news, bad news. Let's just say it out loud. For T.S. Eliot, there is no good news about modernity. Everything pretty much is bad news, and we're going to see that bad news exemplified in our study of the wasteland. All right? If I were to name this lecture, if I were to give it a title, I would call it From April to Shanti. The two words that begin and end the poem. April is the cruelest month, and then the last words of the poem, Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. In between all of those words, right, we're going to ask about the questions that will subsume this poem, about spiritual deprivation, the possibility of any hope. Shanti means peace at the end of the poem. Okay. Some say that by 1925, right, think of it, 1922 is the wasteland, 1925 is the hollow men. That 3 years later, that when he publishes the hollow men, T.S. Eliot is completely done with any chance of hope. Remember how that poem ends? This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. Not with a bang, but a whimper. That's how that poem ends. All hope pretty much gone. You'll remember the multifoliate rose of Death's Twilight Kingdom, the hope only of empty men. We're going to see so many comparisons as we study, so many relationships between the two. Well, let's go ahead and put on our notes, if you need a single line to say what the wasteland is about. It's really about spiritual death. It's really about loss. It's really about the modern world is jacked, right? T.S. Eliot, what he does in this poem then is he provides all kinds of voices to show this. I would underline the word show. It's not that he's going to tell you that the world is jacked. He's going to do that great thing all creative writing instructors will tell their young students. Please, in this poem, don't tell me, show me, right? We hear that all the time. You're going to hear that in this poem. Only you're going to hear it through voices. You're going to have all these different voices that are going to be talking. Now, Eliot never steps in and says, hey, 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 this is the voice of an old woman talking. Hey, 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 this is the voice of an old man talking. No, 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 no. He just literally is going to provide you with words. You have to read the poem to kind of understand what's going on. My job is maybe to help set that up for you. So I'm going to give you a few signposts along the way to kind of help you, okay? That's why I say, though, this poem needs to be experimented and not just read. So let's review now briefly the 5 sections, and then we're going to experience the poem actually together. And by the way, again, I'll give this apology. I've given it already, but I'll give it again. I can't cover this entire poem word for word. I'm sorry, I just don't have the time. I invite you, though, to begin to become curious about the poem. All right, let's go to work. Section 1, Burial of the Dead. I'm hoping that you have a copy of the poem in front of you. I'm hoping that you're annotating that copy of the poem in front of you. I'm hoping that if you don't have a copy of the poem in front of you, that you go and acquire one, okay? So that way we can work good together. Section 1, Burial of the Dead, the first 76 lines. You may want to write that down. Lines 1 through 76. We start in April, which of course is the spring. You would normally think that would be a celebration. Yay, right, spring. No, we're told that April is the cruelest month. Why? Because it stirs bad memories and unfulfilled desires. Whoa. By the way, let's just point out, the words unreal and the words nothing are going to end up again and again, and it makes us think, of course, of Shakespeare's King Lear, doesn't it? Nothing comes from nothing. So we're going to be talking a lot about nothing, which is, of course, going to be ironic right from the start, right? We're going to meet the first voice, Marie. She's a woman. She's going to tell us about some of her childhood memories. She's going to remember a land that no longer grows anything, that she's going to remember a land once where there was stuff that grew. Now there's a land that doesn't grow anything. Were they going to meet a woman, an old woman, Madame Sosteris? She is actually a real person that Eliot was aware of. She's a clairvoyant. That is to say, she's a medium. She tries to read the future, and she does it through tarot cards. For those of you that know anything about the tarot cards, we're going to have a few tarot cards that actually aren't real tarot cards, but are going to end up in this poem. But the quest is to try and find out about the future, right? And of course, let's say that out loud. In many ways, this is a poem about trying to figure out What is the future? What does it look like? I mean, think about that. 1922. So we finished the First World War. And as I've said in other lectures, dude, they didn't call it the First World War. You don't call a war the first. You only call it the First World War once you have a Second World War, right? It was actually called the Great War. And after that war, so devastating to Europe, there were a lot of people kind of standing around going, dude, what's left with this world? It's all jacked up. Finally, the first section will end with zombies walking over London Bridge. Well, they're not actually zombies. They're just normal people. But they're coming home from work, and the way they walk, they pretty much look like zombies. Next time you go to a mall, just sit and watch people carrying their bags, going out of the mall to their car. And ask the question, how are they any different from the zombies that I'm shooting in a video game that I play? I make these comments already in an earlier lecture on the Hollow Men, that T.S. Eliot was very interested in the idea that as modernity came about, we became increasingly less human, less active, less mobile, and for the Wally fans in the house, ended up sitting on chairs and drinking ourselves to death. T.S. Eliot was already pointing towards all of this, and we'll see it at the end of the first section. As we've already said, we're going to finish with those famous lines from Baudelaire. Section 2, Game of Chess. These are lines 77 to 175. There are 95 lines here. We're going to meet another woman. Interestingly, all the speakers in the poem up to this point will have been women. And she's talking with her guy. It's actually the first guy to talk. Well, the first woman actually is in this beautiful room, this luxurious room. We're going to hear about Philomel, which is going to be a disturbing reference, because Philomel, if you know your mythology, she was raped by King Tiresias, and then she had her tongue cut out, and then finally she was turned into a nightingale. This will be also